Welcome to this digital healthcare workshop. Today we're going to be looking at how computer science and mathematics can actually be used to solve a lot of problems in healthcare. Today's workshop is all around epilepsy. So this workshop is to learn about epilepsy, to see how we can use mathematical models to help improve the epilepsy outcomes. We want you to think like a doctor and decide on a treatment plan for a patient with epilepsy, and also consider the risks, uncertainties, limitations of mathematical models and the problems that we currently have with them and why we're still working on them and developing them. There's an additional task that you might have time to do at the end is where we look at digital art and see how we can use art to represent epilepsy and visualize it and explain it to the public. Firstly, we need to understand what epilepsy is. So does anyone in the room know anything about epilepsy? So epilepsy is a condition that affects the brain and it causes seizures. You might have seen this on TV or know people around you who have got epilepsy and they might have told you about this. Seizures are abnormal bursts of electrical activity in the brain that temporarily affects how it works, causing loads of different symptoms. There's many types of seizures. The most common one you might see or might think of is when someone falls to the floor and they convulse and they make rapid movements. That is a seizure, but there's many different types of seizures that can be had. And the problem with epilepsy for doctors and patients is that there's no single test that can diagnose you with epilepsy. It's not that simple. It's diagnosed following at least 2 seizures and they have to occur at least 24 hours apart. So this is the problem. You have to start having seizures and this can take a long time for people to get diagnosed. Usually it can take years. And epilepsy can start at any age. It's not just something you're born with. Anybody can get epilepsy at any stage of their life. And there's many different types and it's a lifelong condition. As soon as you're diagnosed with epilepsy, you have it for life. There's no cure. All we do is manage the seizures and manage the condition. And everyone's condition and experience with epilepsy is different. Epileptic seizures are often triggered by something. Can anyone in the room think of any triggers that they may have heard of before? As we mentioned earlier, everyone's experience with epilepsy is different and so are their triggers. Some of the most common triggers are stress, poor sleep, medication or changes in medication, flashing lights, illnesses, alcohol and the menstrual cycle. And for many people as well, they just don't know their triggers, which can be really hard for them to manage their seizures as they don't know what's causing them. One of the most common triggers people think of is flashing lights, as before TV shows, films, concerts or shows, people make an announcement to the audience when there's going to be flashing lights to let people with epilepsy be aware of this. And even though this is one of the most common triggers people associate with epilepsy, only 3% of people have flashing lights as an epileptic trigger. Let's learn a little bit more about the brain so we can fully understand what's going on. So our brain sends messages through electrical signals. It's how we function as human beings. It's what sends messages, and these electrical impulses are sent via neurons. Can anyone guess how many neurons they think are in our brain? You may have done this in biology yet. There are 86 billion neurons in the brain, and that is an incredibly large number, I think you might agree. And as we said before, seizures are sudden bursts of electrical activity in the brain. So despite the fact that our brain is constantly sending these impulses, like you can see in this video here, a sudden burst of electrical activity is not normal, and that's what causes these seizures. And these can happen in any part of the brain, which is why, again, everyone's seizures and everyone's experience with epilepsy is so different, because it might happen in different parts of the brain, which also might mean that their symptoms of their seizures are very different to everyone else. We can actually measure the electrical activity in the brain using something called EEG. You may have seen this before on the TV where a cap is placed on someone's head and they've got these wires coming out at different points. Each point is detecting the electrical activity in the brain at that specific point. But as we mentioned earlier, there's 86 billion neurons in the brain, so we can't measure all of them. So what are we measuring? On the caps are these certain points where the wires are coming out. We call each one of these points a node, and these nodes lie flat against your scalp, and it detects the electrical activity at that region of the brain. So typically we might have 10 to 20 of these nodes across your scalp. So by measuring around 10 to 20 points of the brain, we can get a good idea of the activity going on in all different regions of the brain. This is an example of what an EEG signal looks like when there is seizure activity detected. So each one of these horizontal lines here depicted by 0, 1, P3, C3, F3, all the way down, each one of these is a different node. So this is detecting the brain activity at that specific point of the brain on the EEG cap. So we have about 15 to 20 nodes here showing us the full map of this person's brain. And this is their brain activity. And we can see there's lots of spikes, there's a lot of high amplitude peaks. It's very irregular, it's not very similar throughout the brain, particularly on the right hand side towards the bottom. There's a lot of sudden bursts of activity, which is showing that this is probably a seizure-like activity in this person's brain. And to analyse this data and to diagnose a patient with epilepsy, the doctors will take this and they will just look at it and they will try and see if they can see seizure activity, just like we have done now. But this is quite hard and it's very subjective because some doctors might decide on different things. It can be very hard to detect seizures, and it's just a visual method. There's no fancy machine, there's no test. Each doctor will just look and decide if this person has epilepsy. And this is what a normal EEG signal will look like. Immediately you can see the difference between the two. There's not as many big spikes. This one looks a lot smoother. It looks way more regular. And now the problem with diagnosis of epilepsy is that, as we mentioned, doctors have to visually look for signs of seizures on the EEG. And that also means the patient has to have a seizure while they are wearing the EEG cap and while it's being recorded. Otherwise, the seizure activity won't be detected. So that means we'll often have to force patients to have a seizure so we can detect the activity. And that's what can be very traumatic for the patients going through this. But the biggest problem as well is that most of the time, patients' EEG signals will look like this. They will look like the normal one. They won't look like the one we saw previously. That one is quite abnormal to get a signal so clearly seizure-like. Even if the patient has seizures, or they are regularly, or they might even already be diagnosed with epilepsy, their brain signal might look like this. So if doctors are just visually diagnosing patients based off this EEG signal, it can be really difficult because there might be a tiny seizure or seizure-like activity happening on the screen right now, and we won't even see it because it also looks quite normal. So how do we diagnose this? This is where we come in, and this is why we try to use maths and computers to help doctors diagnose patients with epilepsy and detect these seizures, because it can be really tricky and it can reduce the amount of time it takes for patients to get diagnosed with epilepsy from years to weeks or months potentially. So what scientists are trying to do, and what we are going to do today, is take the EEG data and use this to create a personalised model of the brain for that patient. We're going to create a fake brain using computers. We can use this brain and analyse it, and we can push it and poke it and prod it and push it to its limits so we can understand the brain of that patient and help provide a suitable diagnosis. We mentioned before that diagnosis can take a really long time for the patient, and also then a really long time to find a right treatment, whether it's medication or surgery. And it takes a long time for them to figure out which treatment option is best for them. But if we can do all these on the brain, we can test the fake brain instead, then we can skip all that waiting time. We don't have to make the patient wait, and we can give them a right diagnosis and the correct treatment options immediately. So how do we actually create a fake brain? So first, we've got this picture here with the circle with all the little dots on. This is the EEG cap. So picture this, you're looking down from above at a person. The little triangle at the top is the person's nose. So can you visualize this? This is the EEG cap on someone's head, and each of the nodes have got a little label on them. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to pick two of the nodes. We're going to look at FP1 in red and F7 in green. So we are just looking at these first two nodes and their EEG signals. What we want to do is see if there's a correlation between these two signals. Does anyone know what a correlation means? So we want to see if there's any similarities between these signals. Is there anything that tells us that they might be connected in some way or have an impact on each other? Do they look the same? Do they have similar features? Things like that. Do you remember earlier when we said that doctors normally do this by eye? So if you were a doctor, what would you say about these two signals? Do you think there's a correlation between them just by looking at them, or is it difficult? I think it's quite difficult. I don't think there's much that screams out to me about these signals. I think it would be really hard to say what the correlation is between these two signals. So what we do is we put these signals into a computer algorithm to tell us if there's a correlation. And the best thing about algorithms is that they tell us the things that we will never be able to see anyway, or things we would never be able to calculate by hand. So if the algorithm tells us that there's a high correlation between these two signals, then they might be very similar or they impact each other. Then we draw a thick line between the two nodes like this on the diagram. And if there's a low correlation, meaning they're not very similar, they don't really interact with each other, these two parts of the brain don't really talk to each other, then we draw a really thin line. And if there's no correlation, then we won't draw any line. This is how we start to build the brain model. So we have now correlated these two nodes, FP1 and F7. We have seen what the correlation is between these two nodes, and we need to do this now for all of the other nodes. So we need to go from FP1 to FP2, FP1 to F3, FZ, and all of the others, and repeat this process and see what the correlation is between every node and every other node. And once we do this, we'll have a personalised brain that looks something like this. It's got loads of lines on, they're all different thicknesses, and it shows you how each node correlates to each other node, how are they connected, how much information they're sending to each other. And it looks like a tangled mess. You'd have no idea what's going on in here. Well, this is our personalised brain. We have now just created a personalised brain network for that patient based on their EEG data. That is it. We've created a computer model fake brain. Now we're going to use this to do our task today. We can push this brain, we can take this brain, we can push it, poke it, push it to the limit and see whether this patient has epilepsy, how we can cause their triggers and how we can find a treatment plan for them. So what we have done is we've taken EEG data from a real human being's brain, which collects brain signals at different nodes of the brain. We've found the correlation between them using computers and mathematical models, and we've mapped this correlation into a brain network to create a personalised fake brain. Easy peasy. And as we've mentioned a few of these things before, the advantages of using a model is that it's personalised to each patient. You don't have to wait for the patient to have a seizure to diagnose them, which is a really big important factor here. You can play around with the model brain to see what causes seizures without causing any harm to the patient, and it supports doctors in their diagnosis and treatment outcomes. And remember, the model does not replace doctors, it just supports them. We are not trying to get rid of doctors. We really need doctors to help support patients, to diagnose them, and this model is there to help support them in the areas where we just can't really do that. So this is what the actual computer model looks like, and this is what you're going to be using today in your tasks. As always with science, we want to start simple so we can fully understand what's going on and then we can build it up. So we're just going to start with 4 nodes today, A, B, C and D. You can see these on the left hand side in the network structure. They're the 4 corners of the brain. So before we had 10 to 15 nodes, it was a big mess when we had that computer model fake brain. To keep things simple, we're just going to start with these 4. So you can imagine A and B at the front of the brain, left and right, C and D, left and right at the back of the brain. Picture that. The network structure we can see on the left hand side, it's important to see here you've got these arrows going between the nodes, and what you'll be able to see is you'll see an arrow going from B to A. The arrow is going in that direction. There's not an arrow going from A to B. This is important. The arrow is going from B to A. That means the majority of the information B is strongly connected to A. It's that way. So all of these arrows mean something. You need to remember that when you're using this model later on. The arrows and the direction of them mean something. And then on the right hand side, you'll see the EEG output. This is the EEG output for each of the nodes. A, B, C and D, and at the minute you can see they're quite calm, kind of like the normal EEG we saw earlier. We're not seeing any really big spikes, we're not seeing any huge activity at the minute. And as we play with the network structure on the left hand side, the EEG data on the right hand side will change. So that's what you're going to do today. You're going to change the network structure, see what happens and figure out if you can treat and diagnose the patients. So what can we actually change within the model? How can we push the brain to its limits? There's 3 different things we can play with within the model. The first one is called node excitability, and this is the node itself, and it tells us how excited that part of the brain is in its natural state. Everyone's brain always has constant activity going on all the time, and this is different for everybody. So we can change that value. We can see if node A is at the front of your brain, how excited is node A just on a day-to-day basis? While you're sitting at your desk right now, how excited is that part of the brain? And if we change that, if we push it to the maximum, what happens? The second one is the connection strength, and this is what we mentioned before. It's how strong the connection, how strong is the correlation between 2 of the nodes. So this is the arrows going between them. We can play with that and we can see how it impacts the EEG. Does a strong correlation and a strong connection strength increase seizure activity or not? Play around and find out. Now the third one is called noise, and this might be a little bit harder to understand as it's a bit more abstract. This is just the background noise that is generally happening within the brain. So when we detect the EEG signal at the certain node of the brain, we're also just picking up general activity in the brain. And again, this is different for everyone. So by using these 3 things, we can play around with the fake brain, see how far we can push it, and if we push one thing and then that causes seizures, we can use that information to figure out what's going on and how to treat the person. So we can figure out the causes of this person's seizures. What we're trying to see is how far we need to push the brain to cause seizure activity, and by finding this out we can work backwards and find a treatment option. So we want to see what is the baseline threshold for that person's brain. For example, if we look at the node excitability, we can think of it like filling up a cup of water. For this person, her baseline excitability is quite low. There's only a little bit of water in the cup. But if we increase the excitability, which means she's experienced a trigger like stress or bad sleep, the cup has increased a little bit more. But this isn't really a problem because it's not overflowing. She can handle it. She can handle this extra activity in the brain and it's not causing a problem for her. Whereas this person, their baseline is much higher. So he only needs a tiny trigger, a tiny lack of sleep, a tiny amount of stress, which causes a trigger and causes seizures. Everybody's baseline is different. The girl on the left, hers is low, so she can handle these extreme stresses and extreme triggers. Whereas the person on the right, his baseline brain is already way higher. His excitability is already way higher. So when he experiences a trigger, even if it's way smaller, it can push him over the edge and have a seizure. This is why everybody's brain is different, and this is what we want to figure out. How much do we need to push someone's brain to cause a seizure? Your job today is to think like a doctor. You need to use the model brain to diagnose patients. See if you can figure out what's causing the seizures for the patients, and then come up with a treatment plan and decide what treatment course you think they need, whether this is medication, monitoring, surgery. But as long as you can use the information you have about that patient, use the model and justify your reasoning in why you think this patient deserves this treatment plan, then that's okay. That is your job today. First, let's go through an example as a class. Let's look at Victoria. We can read her bio and we can use the model to diagnose her and then come up with a treatment plan if she has epilepsy.